another episode of American Reef. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about some unique options of feeding your tank when you're not necessarily around to feed it yourself. Some unique feeding options. Remember, if you are new to reef keeping, head on over to AmericanReef.com. Check out the Reef Tutor video series. Again, well over 200 videos that teach how to keep and maintain a coral reef aquarium. As well, if you're looking for what I consider one of the best fish foods on the planet, you can go to AmericanReef.com. Again, bottom center of the page, you'll see click here to purchase American Reef's HPD. So why are we even talking about unique feeding options? Well, as some of you know, right, myself as well as other family members have been hospitalized for extended periods of time, over the past year, 2 years kind of thing. And it's not gonna end anytime soon, right? And so for me, what that means is that like when that happens, normally you have to kind of rush around to try to find a tank sitter. And no matter who you find, they kind of don't sit the tank the way you would, right? Because they're not you. And number two, it's really not fair, actually, to kind of expect that of them because, again, they've got their own lives, right? So for me, it was one of those things where knowing that I'm going to be away for extended periods of time, right, there are kind of many things that I wanted to try to, we'll call it, automate, but yet at the same time do it in a way that kind of was unique to my special flair, meaning I've got weird criteria for everything that I do. And this is one of those things where there's no exception to it, right? So anyway, I'm going to come out with multiple videos that kind of talk about how I'm solving some of those problems, so it'll help those of you who are in similar kind of situations. And in my particular case, the very first one here is feeding, right? And basically the idea was, how do you basically, be away for 5 to 10 days and still come up with some good feeding options for your fish without relying on somebody else to kind of come and manually feed that tank for you. So before I solve the problem, right, I needed to kind of define what really the problem was or what's my goals. And the very first thing was length of time. Right? I wanted to be able to feed my fish tank for approximately 1 to 2 weeks because that tends to be kind of the periods of time that I'm away from that tank. The second thing is, like, what did I want to feed them, right? I wanted to make sure that I still fed them roughly the same kind of fresh food that I normally feed them, which is that HPD. Again, one of the reasons why I even went to that HPD route is because if you ever go to a fish store and you see this food in containers, you always wonder, like, how long has it been in that container? Things over time will lose their nutritional value, but to me it's kind of one of those snowball effects, meaning that, if you're feeding your fish things that aren't, we'll call it high in nutritional value, then basically they'll start to basically weaken their immune system, and then from there they'll get sick. In my particular case, I've got tangs, right? And their slime coating isn't, uber thick anyway to begin with, so to me, less healthy food means less slime coat, which means more ick, which means basically it wipes out my tank. And it's something that I was trying to avoid. So starting off there, that was my goal, right? So nutritious food for 1 to 2 weeks. How was I going to do that? Well, the general gist was, first of all, I knew that I wanted to make sure that nori was part of their normal diet, right? Because again, the flake foods that existed out there, to me, that all kind of fell into that, hey, I don't know how long it's been there kind of thing. I don't know how much nutritional content that has. But I do know that nori, for example, is very nutritional for them. So I ended up experimenting, and I came up with type 2 forms of nori. Basically, both are shredded, but one is kind of this long cut shred, and another one is this shortcut kind of shred. And the idea behind it, for me, first of all, was I would take and blend that nori into my HPD and normally feed it. Then as I was kind of coming up with feeding solutions, I realized, hey, I'm going to probably need some kind of automatic feeder to do that. Well, if I'm going to use an automatic feeder, that means I need to have something smaller, because if you have sheets, you're still going to have to put your hands in the tank and feed it every day. And if you have something like this, they're too long, right? So they'll get caught into the feeder. But yet something like this works pretty well, right? So I experimented with a bit, making sure that the fish would still eat it and it was healthy. And it didn't change anything there. And then what I did is I would put a little bit in the tank. Well, if you feed anything in your reef tank, right, most of us who have been in reef keeping for a while realize that you have to cut the pumps. If you don't cut the pumps, basically what will happen is the food will kind of stay on top and go right on into the overflows. And then when it goes into the overflows, it's just going to take and clog up kind of filter socks, etc., and it's not doing anybody any good. So for me, I looked at it, and I have that Neptune Apex controller on the tank, and I had the ability to kind of douse the power, feed it, and put it back on. But when I started experimenting with that, one of the things that I kind of realized is network connectivity wasn't always going to be there. It was kind of glitchy. So that means that sometimes I would turn a pump on and it would come on, or it wouldn't come on, right? Because the connectivity wasn't there. Or I'd shut a pump off and it wouldn't go off the first time, or the second time, or the third time. And so I would play with that a little bit, and no matter what I did, I realized that, again, it's just not consistent. And then for me, as you've heard me say before, I'm not a big supporter of putting life support systems on these controllers. I believe the controllers are more from a monitoring perspective. They do a really good job. But now this goes against the grain, because feeding to me is kind of life support. So as I was kind of like experimenting there, I realized that cutting the pumps wasn't going to be the options. But one of these kind of automatic feeders probably could do it for me. Because again, we've got the Neptune Apex. From here, you plug it into their bus, and then from there, you've got your phone app that you could schedule it, so that way if you had lost network connectivity, it would still feed the tank. And then B, if you had connectivity, then you could manually feed it. And again, remember with that tank, I've got video cameras on that thing as well, so I can kind of see what's going on. So to me, I first thought, hey, this was kind of like the winning combination. I'd take an automatic feeder, and I even tried this with the E-Heims, for example, and that worked as well. But the problem with the E-Heims is you don't have control over the E-Heims, right? You really can't. You put it up on a schedule and just drops them off. Where here, on your phone, you can just kind of boom, press a button and basically, have them fed. But the combination kind of worked, meaning, with this shredded nori, this would basically feed it, and it worked out really fine from a distribution perspective. Now, the very first thing you'll realize is when you feed that freshwater tank, if you don't have some kind of feeding ring, like I said, it's going to go right over the top. But when you get that feeding ring and you kind of put it in there, you'll find out that as soon as the shredded nori kind of gets moist, it'll fall a little bit, but not quite enough down to the bottom. So again, it'll kind of float in the water column, and then bam, it goes over the overflow. It's not doing anybody any good. So I kind of experimented and said, well, hey, what if I take and put this in the sump? I'll take this feeder, put it over an edge, right, and then put it in the sump area right above where the pump kind of draws the water back to return. That way there, it'll just kind of feed the tank that way. And though that worked, what didn't work there was your plumbing coming from your sump, I should say. You probably bleed off a line for GFO, for calcium, for ROX, for those kind of reactors. And when you do that, basically food will get caught in there and just, again, clog it up, decompose, and again, not do anybody any good. So that was a bad option as well. Experimented a little more, and what happened was I realized we want to go deep, right? Mike Pellet, for example, had an option where you would basically take, I'll call it a cone for the lack of a better word, and it would go down into the tank where he would feed his kind of, basically the pellet foods. And problem with it is there was no net at the bottom, so fish would get stuck in the middle, or they would go up and kind of jump out. And at the end of the day, basically that feeding kind of tube didn't really work really well for him. There's a lot of other options that are out there, kind of homemade acrylic kind of options, where basically they solve that depth part, but they still don't have a net in there, right? And then fish kind of splash about, and then hanging on the mounting, I never found a solution that I was really happy with. And I probably tried 4 or 5 solutions out there. Then at one point in time, I came across this little box here, right? Basically, it's a Tunze mangrove box. And you can kind of see, basically, we have a box connected via magnets with, at the bottom, this kind of grate system. And I looked at it, and it was a lot bigger than I expected. It was kind of like, again, 5 inches by 4.5 or something like that. So it was a big box. But what I liked about it is, with this magnet, I could move it anywhere that I kind of had the feeder. Now remember, in my tank, I don't have a whole lot of real estate to put the feeders. So what I ended up doing is I put the feeders on top of the lights. And positioning was such that I didn't have them much on the overflows or anything like that, where I just couldn't put the feeder anywhere. So it had to go on top of the lights. But you know, having this box, basically with the magnet form being the outside, it allowed me to move it where I wanted it to, and to easily put it in and put it out. Because again, I didn't want this to be a permanent solution, but I wanted it to be a solution so that way, if I am gone, I can either walk somebody through it, or I can have it set up and ready to go for them. And so with this box, as soon as I got one in, I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is kind of unique, meaning that it was deep. So the very first thing I did is I took, and when I was cutting my macroalgae in my sump, I took a huge handful of what I call waste, and I threw it in here. And I experimented enough, and what was really slick about it is I was able to put enough macroalgae in there to basically feed that tank for somewhere around 3 to 4 days. And that right there was kind of a revelation to me. Meaning, remember, I want something that's nutritious for the tank. And so now I'm actually taking the waste that I'm using for filter and feeding it back, and talk about that circle of life kind of thing, right? I mean, that was just awesome. So that was one of these things where I really liked the feeder for that particular purpose. Then what I did is I said, well, hey, I've got long cut, right? I've got this shredded long cut Nori. Will that work in here too? And the thing about it is, that's just because I couldn't imagine myself growing enough macroalgae that I could constantly use it to feed this box. So then what I ended up doing is I would take, like, you know, huge, we'll call it like pinches like that, right? And I would put it in there, and I'd put, again, 3, 4, 5, same kind of thing. With this long cut kind of shred into this box, it would be enough to feed the tank for 3, 4 days. And not all of it would come out through the bottoms, right? But most of it would. And I found out that if I took a pair of wire cutters, for example, and I'll call it like cutting a relief hole, but I would take one of the slats out of each one of these. It was big enough so that fish could get up in there and pull it if they needed when it came down, and it worked out perfectly. So from a Nori perspective, I thought, wow, okay, I can feed my fish Nori for a 3, 4, 5 day period of time, and nobody has to feed the tank. So that's part of my solution. But then I looked at it and I kind of wanted to expand that diet, because as we know from an HB perspective, my main staples, for example, are the HPD, the Nori, and maybe some reef chili is what I kind of blend in there. That's their normal diet. So the next goal for me was, okay, if I'm going to use these automatic feeders, for example, can I get not only Nori into an automatic feeder, but can I get the HPD in a feeder? And so I called the manufacturer, and again, as you all know, you know, I'm fortunate enough that they allowed me to kind of offer that HPD up. So I asked them if they had a pellet form, right, that they can make for me that, you know, again, it would allow me the same nutritional value, but then more importantly, something that I knew was fresh, right? So as you've heard me say before, I don't know how long that food has been in these canisters per se. So for me, I know this is a couple of weeks old, so I know that I'm getting fresh food, and I kind of like that option. So what I did is talk them for a little bit and come up with this kind of pellet form. And what I did first was played with it to make sure that the nutritional value of it, for example, was kind of the same as, again, the HPD, the other form. And for the most part, the only way that I could really tell this was by the fish themselves, right? Their bellies, their colors, were they getting sick, and that sort of thing. So I experimented for, you know, 6 months, 8 months, and from that perspective, I was pretty happy. So I had a solution here now, right? I was like, okay, I'll take one box, one feeder, right? And that will be for, we'll call it the Nori side of it. So that means I can take 3 to 4 days, slap it in there, and then I'll put a feeder over top of it so I can feed the shortcut of it beyond that 4 or 5 day perspective. Then what I was going to do is take and mix that in with the pellets, because again, with the pellets end of it, if you use a deep box like this, what it'll allow you to do is that pellet will go in, right, and it'll sit on top, right? And again, if you have a normal feeding ring, etc., like I said before, what happens, the food will kind of float down and zoom, it'll go straight over the overflow. Well, here, it's going to stay up on top, right, until it actually sinks. And then when it sinks down towards the bottom, then we know that it's heading basically down, and we don't have to worry about that overflow thing. So basically, it'll catch it in the water column. So my solution ended up being basically 2 boxes, 2 feeders, one with Nori, one with the HPD pellet, and I actually mixed the other things with the pellet as well, meaning there are like the various kind of garlic pellets that exist out there. There are the pellets that, for example, for certain color enhancements, because to me, again, this is a short time solution where I'm feeding it, and blending it is just one of those things where it can't hurt. My main goal is I just wanted to make sure it hit this box to go down. And the other really cool thing about this box, see this wide top? Beautiful, right? Meaning that when you have some of these other solutions, they don't have wide tops. And when this barrel, for example, right, comes out, and when you look at it and it kind of spins, it's going to lay a path of food down. And that path of food could be 1, 2, 3 inches kind of thing. And again, having something that's kind of wide enough, like this big opening at the top, really makes it that much easier. So that way there, lining up the feeder, for example, with this box was easy, and we knew the food, for example, would hit it, as opposed to kind of half go in, half go out kind of thing. So from that perspective, that was kind of my solution that I kind of put in place. And again, rather than talk about it, let's just kind of go down to that tank and kind of let me show you the setup that I've got. And right now I've got 1 feeding box with 1 of the feeders kind of on there, and I can kind of show you at least how it works. And again, for me, it's one of those things where it's perfect for you to kind of look at it and say, hey, did you ever think about this? And kind of adjust it accordingly, to maybe fix some problems that I haven't thought about. So let's go down to the tank. So before I demonstrate the various feeding methods, let's kind of do a recap of what I got here. Again, I've got the lights on top, not a whole lot of room per se, or shelf space I should say, except on top of the lights. So that's where I have the automatic feeder. The automatic feeder in turn drops the food into what I'll call is the feeding box, but we know it's the Tunze, I guess, mangrove box. And you'll notice from there I have this pump here. Well, I had a spare MP40 floating around since I basically transitioned to the Tunzes, and so the idea behind this pump was I wanted to see if by drawing the food down across and shooting it across the tank, if it would feed the tank any better. And I haven't noticed that big of a difference. I'm keeping it on for now because I usually test things in kind of 6 month to a year kind of increments anyway. So we'll see how it goes. My nitrates haven't kind of rose by adding this pump, because I would think it would after a while, meaning you're shooting food across and basically it's getting stuck between, whatever, rocks, underneath rocks and stuff like that. And I don't have a really great cleanup crew in here anyway, so I would expect it to rise, but at the same time, it's just one of those things where I'm experimenting with now, and when it actually feeds the tank, it's actually kind of cool to some degree, meaning, you don't have all those animals just kind of in turn, hovering around this box per se. When you feed it and it gets basically dispensed through the tank, little pieces shoot out, and that way the fish just kind of eat them in the water column per se, so it's not like an event. Anyway, enough about the pump, but that's how I've got this kind of set up here. The other thing you'll notice is with this magnet, I've kind of got it so I'm only using the bottom kind of third of the magnets, because for me, I wanted to be able to pull it down, pull it up, and I don't need the strength that these magnets have. You know, again, this was meant to hold up, I guess, basically sand and mangroves, so they're really strong magnets, and I don't need that. So at this point, that's kind of how I've got this thing set up. And what we'll do is I'll take and we'll drop a little bit of food, and we'll do the HPD pellets, for example. We'll put them in here, and you can kind of see how it drops down through the feeding box and how it kind of feeds the tank. Now, again, the HPD pellets, basically, they're kind of designed to sink, but there will be a few of them that will kind of float up on top. And you'll kind of see how it just pulls, again, those pellets across, just with having that pump there. And from there, you know, the fish now are just kind of standing in front of it. But again, if you kind of look up on top of here, you can see there are a few of those pellets that didn't sink. And those are the ones, for example, that would end up kind of over in that overflow. Now, one of the things you'll notice from this top-down view is you'll see those little holes that I actually cut out in the bottom of that grate. Again, nothing special, but at the same time it allows for some of the pellets to flow down through and other ones to actually stay on top of the grate until some sort of current or, you know, whatever motion pulls it down through it. The other thing that will happen is the fish will actually tend to pick at it. But again, with the thickness of them, they're going to be picking quite a long time before they actually get anywhere. Now, one thing to notice on those pellets is they are pretty big, meaning the tangs sometimes have an issue, not the bigger tangs, for example, like the hippo tang, etc. They didn't have an issue eating them, but the ones with the smaller mouths, they kind of have issues actually eating those pellets. That's why, again, for that extended period of time, what I also tend to do is have this, right? Again, this is the shredded nori, and it's the same kind of thing where you just basically pop it on top, and I'll put a lot of it. And then we'll just kind of let it do its thing. And what will happen is it will feed that tank, you know, depending on how much I feed that or fill that box up, it'll feed that tank for a long period of time. And again, my goal was actually taking it for 5 days to 10 days, right? So that in case I wasn't here. And like, so when you look at that, the amount that I just put in there, that's probably enough to feed that tank for about a day and a half. And when you look at it, the box, there's all kind of room in it. And again, to me, that's one of those things where that's probably my second choice, meaning my first choice is actually having the macroalgae and the sump, which I'll kind of show you next, to put in there. My second choice will be feeding the shredded nori, but then at the same time, you know, my last choice would be kind of the pellet foods. And just because, again, with the noris and the greens and that with the tang, at least with this particular tang, I want them to have those organics. So now, kind of, again, as my preferred method, I prefer using actually the macroalgae in that sump. And for me, it's one of those things where it's really kind of cool, that circle, I call it circle of life, and I'm not exactly sure if that's the best way to describe it, but the fact that you feed the tank, right, the tank in turn produces, again, those nitrates, phosphates, etc., which those macroalgae use to grow, and then in turn, you prune them, which, again, promotes more filtration, we'll call it, or more absorption or more growth, and in turn, you feed that. So you kind of have this source of natural food that is probably secondary to none. And to me, again, I prefer that method most. The problem that I have is sometimes you just don't have enough macroalgae down there. So like what I'll do now is I'll show you how much I prune now. And for me, when I prune this will be enough to feed the tank for about 5 to 10 days, like I said. And it will take me at least probably 3 weeks to 6 weeks, it depends, right, to actually grow the macroalgae back to kind of replenish, we'll call it, the volume of macroalgae that I actually took out of it. So it's not quite a one-for-one, and that's why, again, for my end of it, it works really good for that 5 to 10 day spell. But to try to harvest it to basically keep this tank going constantly, I don't have enough space, obviously. I think with bigger sumps, obviously you could probably do that, but with this size, you know, we've got issues. So let me actually go down and I'll kind of cut some, and you kind of see how much I'm actually taking out and feeding in that box, which will last, again, 5 to 10-ish days. So while I'm down here pruning some macroalgae out, let me kind of go over a couple things that you haven't seen, and I'll do a tank update later on. But basically, what you're going to notice is 2 skimmers. Right, with these 2 skimmers, last time one of my experiments was actually to test the all-in-one bio pellets, and with those all-in-one bio pellets, again, after that test was done, I wanted to experiment a little more with kind of removing filter socks, for example, and just using skimmers. And again, I didn't want to go the traditional route, meaning I've had large skimmers, etc. So I wanted to try 2 smaller ones just to kind of see, again, how they've kind of worked out. And these are the Tunze 9004s. And again, later on we'll kind of do an update to see how they're going, but that's one thing you'll notice there. And obviously I've got the Tunze LED as well, just to kind of spur the growth. Now the other thing that I want to talk about too is when you're pruning the macroalgae, what I tend to do is I tend to take it from various parts, meaning my goal is to actually promote growth. So to promote growth, what I want to do is I'll take it from the top, I'll take it from the sides, like over here, and I'll just kind of get it all over. That way it kind of stimulates the macroalgae, and I found that basically tends to help a lot as it relates to the growth perspective. The other thing you'll notice, I've got this power head down in here, and it's kind of contradictory, meaning normally when you have skimmers, right, you don't want a power head involved, meaning you want it to skim off the surface. But the nice thing about these Tunzes is it not only takes the water from the top, but it takes it from the bottom. And for me, I had originally had that power head in there, again, to stimulate growth of the macroalgae. Right? And again, see the macroalgae here, I'll take larger leaves as opposed to the younger ones. And you know, this kind of gives you an idea, and here happens to be a clump that I can use already. So that gives you kind of an idea, at least from a pruning perspective, how I prune, how much I take out. And again, if this were the ultimate kind of, we'll call it ball of macroalgae, the idea would be to have it constantly rotating, so that way it is getting light and nutrients around, you know, 360 degrees per se. In my particular case, again, it's not the perfect mousetrap, but it's one that I'm using here anyway. So you can kind of see how much I've thinned that out, and I could probably take more, but for now we'll just kind of take this up there and we'll feed it to the tank. So as you can kind of see now, again, it's a pretty good chunk of pruning per se, and from a feeding perspective, we'll just kind of drop it down in there, and then we'll kind of let that thing go, and we'll let them pick at it. And I probably could have took double the amount and put it in there, but for now, you know, it's one of those things where, from a pruning perspective, I didn't want to take that much out of there. It needed a little more growth, at least in my opinion. Again, my 5 to 10 day goal of doing this, by far, it wouldn't work if we didn't have the automatic feeders. But just feeding it from here is just one of the things where it wouldn't do it. But the combination of adding 2 boxes, one to feed kind of, again, your shredded Noris, for example, and with the pellets, that kind of works out really well. And then the second part is, having feed your fish normally, basically, from this kind of box and growing your own food. That's kind of a cool thing, and I kind of like that. My main issue is having a box that's 4 by whatever by 5 in the front of your tank. We have these tanks so that they are pretty and and colorful and that sort of thing. And to me, getting rid of pumps and boxes is one of those things where that's really kind of a good goal of mine. And with this box here, it's kind of an eyesore. That being said, though, if you look at the colors of the fish and being able to kind of feed the tank automatically and naturally per se, it's probably a good trade-off. So with that being said, let me wash my hands and we'll wrap it up. So this gives you an idea of what it looks like with the macroalgae. Again, you can kind of see that big one where they'll kind of pull it out, and it's kind of like, I'll call it like when you run a thread through a needle, meaning they don't get basically huge chunks, but they kind of pull it out in those threads. And the nice thing about that, again, is if it goes over the overflow, what do I care? Because it's going to go back into that refugium area, basically, and continue to grow. And it's, as opposed to kind of decomposing in a sock or something like that. So that kind of works out pretty good. See the way I've got this thing laid out, it kind of hits my goals, meaning I can feed those fish for 1 to 2 weeks with nutritious kind of food that's not going to let all this food go to waste, so to speak, and cause some kind of nitrate disaster, or phosphate, I guess, actually. And it's one of those things where I don't consider this the be-all end-all. I consider it to be a work in progress. And for those of you maybe who have not thought of something like this before, check it out and see what you think about it. And if you have, and maybe there are some tweaks that I could make, feel free to share that information with me as well. Again, it's AmericanReef@me.com. I'd love to hear kind of the tweaks that I could do to make this better. And again, same kind of thing, if you don't have the Pellet HPD or the shredded Nori or this kind of stuff, I threw that on the page. That's the link where you can buy the HPD. So AmericanReef.com, bottom center, there's a little link that says click here to purchase HPD. Again, this is nothing but shredded Nori, but if you can't shred it, then you can pick it up there. And this kind of stuff here, I had a couple boxes, so I threw those out there. But again, if you're looking at it, help support my sponsors, like you've heard me say many, many times, right? They're good guys, honest guys that deserve a chance to earn your business. And look at Tunze, for example, which is one of the sponsors. They come up with this little box which nothing else existed out there, and this provides a ton of value, right? And these magnets, I mean, gosh, it's one of those things where you literally can grow that mangrove in there, it won't slide down. But to me, it's just one of those things where you can't find stuff like that, and these kind of guys have thought of it, and in this particular case, it's helping me out dramatically. And as well as all the other kind of products like the automatic feeders, etc. And again, they are bulk reef supply, premium aquatics, and ecosystems. Again, they're all good guys, honest guys that deserve that chance. Again, any questions you have for me, send them over to AmericanReef@me.com. Otherwise, thanks for watching this episode of American Reef.